Good evening, everyone. I will be your host tonight, Mr. Dead Sleep. I'll be taking you through 5 tales of terror brought to you by some great authors who posted their short stories to NoSleep on Reddit. This is my first video of many, so I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe, and if you feel like commenting, awesome. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Sit back, lay back, whatever's most comfortable for you, and enjoy. Our first story tonight has to do with someone who is trapped in an addiction treatment center. So here we go. I'm trapped in an addiction treatment center and being held against my will. I knew treatment would be a nightmare, but I never imagined this. A disturbing letter slipped out of an envelope today as I was delivering the morning mail. I'm pretty worried about the guy who wrote it. Here's what it said. Dear reader, my name is Seth and I'm an alcoholic, but I don't belong here. I was sent to Burning Oaks Treatment Center involuntarily after my parents followed an interventionist's advice. That was in May 2018. I'm risking my safety by sneaking this letter into the staff's outgoing mailbox. If I get caught, this could be the last letter I ever write. I think people are dying. The counselors here watch my every move. They're always watching, except when they're on lunch break. They read my mail, monitor my phone calls. They even watch me piss. They tell me who I can talk to, for how long, and when. I get one phone call to my parents each week, and even then, staff listens in and sets a timer for 5 minutes. When the timer goes off, the line goes dead. Staff coaches us before the phone calls, telling us what to say. Keep it about news, weather, and sports, my counselor Greg said. Ask how they're doing. For clients, rule number 1 is this. Never tell your family what really goes on here, or else. Every month my parents think I'm getting out of here, but then staff calls with the same story. He's still sick. He needs more treatment. That's what they tell all the clients' families. When I tell staff I'm ready to go home, they say, that's your disease talking. All the clients have been here for years. Not one client has left. Burning Oaks has always felt like a prison, but lately, things have gotten weird. Every morning at sunrise, we do yard work for 2 hours. Rain, snow, tornado, or hail, we do yard work. Even if the sky is spitting out golf ball-sized hail, we do yard work. No excuses. One day a client was projectile vomiting during a cold turkey heroin withdrawal, and they shoved a rake in his hand and said, "Stop crying and get to work." The other day as we raked leaves by the woodshed, 2 white unmarked vans pulled up, and several men in hard hats jumped out and went into the lobby. Minutes later they came out carrying several large boxes with what looked like office supplies hanging out of them. They packed them into vans, then drove off. "What's that about?" Scott, my other roommate, asked. I shrugged. After we finished chores, we went into the cafeteria, but the clock on the wall was missing. A black cord dangled where the clock had stood. And the clocks had been stripped from the walls in the hallway by the front desk, too. "Where'd the clocks go?" I asked Rocky, the behavioral tech. He shrugged, but said nothing. And all the alarm clocks had been taken from our bedrooms. Not one clock remained in the building. The next morning, events took a darker turn. A client, Bridget, walked up to the staff counter to ask Nurse Betsy for some over-the-counter pain reliever for her toothache. Nurse Betsy glared at her. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I watched from a distance. After a moment, Betsy rose from her seat, leaning toward Bridget from behind the glass panel, shouting. Bridget started crying, covering her face to mask her sobs. Then another nurse stormed out from the back office and grabbed Bridget's arm. I started to approach, but it was too late. Bridget wailed, trying to wrestle away from the nurse. But the nurse doubled down on her grip, then dragged Bridget by her hair and forced her into the back of the office. No one saw Bridget again after that. The next day, we were supposed to get time to call our families, but staff announced an emergency meeting instead. "Everyone come to the front room," Mr. Owen shouted from the hallway over a megaphone. When we entered the room, staff was seated in a circle, motioning for us to sit on the floor. I felt like a kindergartner gathering for story time. "What's going on?" Scott asked Rocky, who glared back. Then Mr. Owen spoke. "We've decided to do away with phone privileges for a while," he said. "Some of you have misbehaved. Until I see improvement, there will be no more phone calls, incoming or outgoing." "What do you tell our families?" Lauren, another client, asked. "That we're still sick and need more treatment? Isn't that what you tell our families every month? Do you also tell our families how you watch creepy videos of us in the back office?" I fumed, clenching my jaw. Adrenaline coursed through me. Before I could speak, Mr. Owen rose and walked toward Lauren, towering over her like a guard. "What do we tell them?" he asked, raising the pitch of his voice, mocking her. "We tell them you can't get your act together, and we've revoked your phone privileges." He turned, then gestured toward staff, who followed him out of the room without another word. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to a shuffling sound outside my door. Low, muffled voices sounded as two people whispered outside the door. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. It was one male and one female voice. Nurse Betsy and someone else. "No, we can't do it now," the woman whispered, her tone anxious. "Then when?" the man snapped back. "Mr. Owen, that impatient, condescending tone. Who else?" "I'll tell him it's his new medicine," the nurse said. Goosebumps rippled over me. I leaned closer. "Tell him the doctor ordered it," Mr. Owen said. "Do it in the morning." Whatever this was, I didn't like the sound of it. The next morning, Scott and I chatted in the cafeteria after our chores. "I'm getting out this week," he said. "Did you hear?" I slapped his back. "Yeah, good luck with that, man. No one gets out of here." He grunted. "I'd better," he said. "I've followed all their rules. There's no reason to keep me here." "There's no reason to keep most of us here," I said, shaking my head. A second later, Nurse Betsy waltzed in with a paper cup and handed it to Scott. "What's this?" he asked, frowning. "Take it," she snarled. "What is it?" "It's your new meds, doctor's orders." "Meds for what?" "Take the meds," she commanded. Scott popped a cup of pills into his mouth, dry swallowing them. "Good boy," she said, sarcastic. Next, Rocky came in. "Scott, time for your UA." "Right now?" he asked. "Why doesn't anyone else have to do one?" Staff did random drug tests throughout the week, but usually they drug tested us in groups. They didn't often single out one client unless they had reason to suspect something. In this case, they had no reason for suspicion. Scott was the model client. He hadn't broken a single rule. "I don't have to pee yet," he said. "Then drink some water and hurry." Scott chugged his water, then followed Rocky to the men's room. Hours later, after we had returned to our rooms, Mr. Owen knocked. "Scott," he said, "you failed your UA. It was positive for methamphetamine." He wagged his finger like a parent. Furious, Scott rose from the bed, clenching his fists. "That's impossible. I haven't touched meth or any other drug in 2 years. And if you don't watch your tone, I'll tell your parents that I'm recommending another year here. I'll tell them you're very sick and you need more treatment." A menacing gleam twinkled in Mr. Owen's eyes. Then he left. After that, clients started disappearing. Scott vanished first. One day, after chores, we went inside to look for him, but he was gone. "Did he go home?" I asked. Nurse Betsy laughed, shaking her head, but said nothing. The next morning, Ryan vanished. His belongings remained scattered throughout the bedroom, but no sign of Ryan. Staff wouldn't say a word about it. Later that evening, Lauren and another girl both vanished. We have to figure out what's going on, I said to Nate, my other roommate. Where are they taking everyone? Nate asked. They have to be on the property somewhere. But this place was pretty small, with just a few trailers scattered across the tiny campus. We had the main building where we slept, a trailer for the morning groups, and a trailer for medical visits. That was it. Then Nate's eyes widened. What about the woodshed? You really think they'd be in there? I asked, my heart thumping. We'll look tomorrow, Nate said, during yard work. But the next morning, when we went to open the shed, we found a giant lock hanging from a chain around the door. I tapped on the door, then peered through the foggy windows, but they were covered with an opaque curtain. Hear anything? Nate asked as I pressed my ear against the door. Look for staff, I whispered, still listening. That's when I heard it. A low rumble, some kind of movement sounded from inside. Then the sound of chains clanking against metal, a low muffled sound. What the? I started, but at that moment, Nate waved his hand, signaling me for me to step away. I hurried away from the shed as Mr. Owen headed toward us. He hadn't seen me. Nate, he said, his voice stern. We've got your mother on the phone. She says it's an emergency. Nate followed Mr. Owen back inside. That was 2 days ago. I haven't seen him since. On my way back to the bedroom last night before I went to sleep, I overheard Nurse Betsy chatting on the phone. I know Mr. Clayton, she said. Scott's dad. My ears perked up, but I pretended I wasn't listening. We thought he was getting out this week too, but he relapsed. He's still very sick, she said. He needs more treatment. Sighing, I went to my room and closed the door. Sometime late last night, I woke up to someone tapping at the window. I peered through the blinds and pressed my nose against the glass, scanning the darkness for the source of the sound. Then Ryan's face appeared at the window. He was pale and bug-eyed and gesturing wildly. But his mouth. What's wrong with his mouth? I wondered, squinting. Stitches. A jolt of terror shot through me as reality set in. His mouth was stitched shut, with dried blood crusted to the corners of his mouth like old ketchup. He waved a piece of cardboard toward the window, but at first I couldn't read it. I leaned in, then saw it. You're next. I don't know who will find this letter, but please, help. Sincerely, Seth Brown. Okay, now on to story number 2. This one is titled, There's Something Wrong with My Blood. And here we go. I grew up in a small community in the south of Minnesota called St. Gall. We were 8 families, all loosely related. Uncles and aunts from both sides of my family, along with the grandparents and 2 outsider families not directly related by blood. It was a remnant of the hippie era, and my mother grew up out there. It was originally meant to be some sort of farming commune for people who wanted to live on their own terms without going completely off the grid. It isn't like a religious gathering or a cult, as many believe. It was all about a different way of life and living closer to the earth. My mother left St. Gall for a few years to study sociology, and that's where she met my dad. I was an accidental pregnancy, and my dad didn't want to stick around. My mother moved back to St. Gall and had me in the early 90s. I was born in the house I grew up in. Life out in St. Gall wasn't as odd as one might think. I still went to school. I just had to take an earlier bus. We still went into town at least once a week, and I had many friends that I got really close to over the years. Still, there was always that air of being different around me. My mom explained that a lot of the parents of the kids at school didn't like the people from St. Gall because we were different, a bit odd. My mom was terrified of a lot of things, but mostly blood. That was her number one fear. And if I ever hurt myself, she would try to cover it up as fast as possible. It was strange, because I saw kids skin their knees at school all the time without anyone freaking out. I never hurt myself like that, since my mom was adamant about me being needlessly careful. It came to the point where I sometimes had to wear elbow and knee guards to school, which landed me in plenty of trouble from bullies. But my childhood came and went. Elementary school turned into middle school, which turned into high school. Things got rough then, fast. On the best of days, I was a Gaul kid, but most of the time they just called me a Jesus freak, cultist, or even a school shooter. I was branded an outsider without there ever really being a reason. I guess that's just what it's like being a teenager. I also refused to take the precautions my mother asked me to. I stopped wearing elbow and knee guards to gym class. Our teacher had a deal where kids could go to the gym instead of playing team sports, but I was tired of being separated. I'd compromise with my mom by wearing several layers of clothes, but I'd usually just wait for her to be out of sight before I took something off. If she ever knew I was pretty good at both soccer and basketball, she'd have a heart attack. It was during those first few PE classes that I started noticing something was different about me. Sure, we were all still growing up, but I was growing a bit different. I was almost completely hairless in comparison to other boys, and my hair was growing lighter. I'd gone from brown hair to strawberry blonde in about 2 years. I would also start to notice a weird smell coming from the other boys. They really stank. It took me several years to notice that they weren't actually the ones who were different. I was. They smelled like people were supposed to smell. My sweat, on the other hand, was sweeter. Not necessarily in a good way, but just weirdly sweet by comparison. Not sugary, but more like the smell of thick dairy. I hadn't thought about it, I just figured that was the way sweat was supposed to smell. It wasn't. I'd made one friend in high school, Darren. Short guy who dropped in and out of social cliques like it was his job. I talked to him about it and asked him to smell me. Weird, I know. And he agreed that something was off. He convinced me to talk to the school nurse, thinking it might be something like diabetes. I was scared he'd tell someone about it, but he never did. Good guy. I had a long chat with the school nurse, Anita. She was very reassuring. Apparently, puberty can have all sorts of weird effects on the human body. A sweet smell coming from your sweat was hardly the worst she'd seen, or in this case, smelled. It was weird, sure, but this was a weird time to be a human. Still, she decided to run a few blood tests just to make sure my iron levels and white blood cells were okay. As soon as she poked the needle through my arm, she recoiled and crinkled her nose. The syringe dropped to the floor, and I got up. She got a tissue and started to blow her nose repeatedly over and over. "What the hell was that?" she exclaimed. "What did you—" I had no idea what she was talking about. I looked at the drop of blood poking out of my arm, and I didn't notice anything odd. I just put a Band-Aid on it while Anita tried to regain her composure. Come back tomorrow," she coughed. "We'll talk more, okay?" But she was sick the next day. I felt uncomfortable with the whole thing, and I wanted to talk to my mom about it. But I also didn't want her to get worried. When you have someone in your life that is always on the breaking point, you make a habit out of stepping carefully. It took Nurse Anita the rest of the school week before she returned to her job. I was immediately summoned to the nurse's office. She'd lost weight, a lot of it. She was drinking water from a large bottle when I got there, and she had dark markings around her eyes. She didn't seem well. But she lit up as she looked at me. Anita asked me for a new blood test, and I agreed. She lined up 4 syringes. Her hands were shaking, but she regained her focus once the needle got closer to my arm. Step by step, she filled the syringes, but she seemed to get more and more excited as she did. I can swear she was sniffing my neck. The whole thing was weird, and I left as soon as she gave me a Band-Aid. She promised to run some tests and let me know as soon as she was done. But she wanted me to return at least once a week for a checkup. Apparently, sweet-smelling sweat was a bigger deal than I had anticipated. I asked her if I should see a doctor, but she just shook her head. As I left the nurse's office, I looked back. She was standing in the doorway, staring at me from across the hall. Her eyes never left me. She was staring at my neck, drinking from her water bottle. This time, I told my mother. I had no idea how much she would overreact. Instead of talking to Nurse Anita, she pulled me out of school the same day. She threw our entire lives into boxes, breaking at least half of our dinnerware in the process. In less than a weekend, she'd packed up everything and hired a truck. I barely had time to hug my grandparents goodbye before we were out of town. I was forced to switch my phone number, and my mother swore that if I didn't remove my social media accounts, she'd smash every touchscreen we owned. I'd never seen her like that before. I was terrified. That's how we ended up in Sabre, Michigan. Of course, my mom couldn't check on me all day long. I did get time to check in on my social media. Darren, still in disbelief about me leaving soon, told me things had gotten weird at school. Nurse Anita had started asking questions about where I'd moved, and when the principal couldn't reveal that information, she'd gotten aggressive. The police got involved, and it was revealed that she'd taken my blood samples home. Things got unclear at this point, but Darren, whose mom works at the sheriff's office, had spoken over dinner about Nurse Anita apparently drinking blood straight from the syringes. But that wasn't all. In the days that followed, she was taken into custody. She was doing some sort of hunger strike and couldn't even keep down water. She actually died from dehydration right there in county jail, surrounded by paramedics trying to understand why her body was actively resisting an IV. By now, my mom and I had settled in a small 3-bedroom apartment. I confronted her about Nurse Anita and what happened. My mom finally opened up to me. "You know what capsaicin is?" she asked. "It is the thing in spicy food that makes your tongue and throat hurt. It is a kind of self-defense thing that is supposed to make us stay away." I had heard about it, and I was unaware of the concept. "This thing that is supposed to make us stay away just makes it more enticing," she explained. "People can get addicted to it. To many, it has the opposite of the intended effect. It became something to be desired instead of something that protects the plant. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I sort of was. I didn't want to think I was, but I was. "Our family is different," she told me. "I was hoping this wouldn't happen to you, but it did, and we had to move." She really did try to bring me a normal life. She tried not to worry, but whatever is inside me was growing extremely potent. I started to understand why her family had lived isolated and why she wanted me to be careful around the others. As a kid, it wasn't as dangerous, but as a teenager, it was stronger than ever. And that's why I was noticing my own smells. They'd gotten stronger. But the years passed. My mom got a job at a gas station, and I helped out as a farmhand and cherry picker. Things were going pretty well, all things considered, until last year. I was picking up my mom from the night shift, early in the morning, when a truck on the opposite lane ran a red light. We were hit. It wasn't a bad hit, but it was bad enough to send us into a spin and into a nearby ditch. Mom had been looking through her purse and smashed her head against the passenger window, and I head bashed the steering wheel. The passenger side of the rear half of the car was folded like origami. I barely even remember what happened next. I remember the truck driver coming to check on Mom, only to drag her out on the pavement. I remember paramedics and a police car. I remember eyes looking at me, delirious and dark. Open, bloody mouths, tendons snapping. A sweet, flowery smell drowning out the gasoline pouring from the car. Red. I remember seeing a half-eaten face, slowly being torn apart. Eyes that used to comfort me having lost their light. A slack-jawed nightmare having clothes and limbs torn apart and splayed on the concrete like a flattened toad. I don't remember much about getting away. I was chased through a field of wheat and threw up in a water bucket next to a well. I hid in a barn and covered myself in hay to dampen the smell of my blood. I remember a flashlight passing over me as 3 people left, desperately looking somewhere else. Bloody mouths still chewing, pupils so large their eyes looked black. They were barely even breathing, their breath so short I couldn't see their chest move. I made it. I would never speak of this in person, as I don't want to risk anyone finding me. I've moved twice since that incident, and I'm starting to understand what I am. The problem is, I've started to get cataracts. I know, it's at an early stage, but it's definitely there, and it's progressing rapidly. I'm going to need surgery. Someone has to operate on me, and I fear I'll never wake up from that surgery. I have no idea what to do. I can't live like this, constantly fearing someone will get too close and catch a whiff of me. No wonder my mom had to leave my dad. No wonder she was always afraid. You're all hunting me. You just don't know it yet. Okay, moving on to our third story of the night. I hope all of you are cleaned up because this has something to do with something found in the shower. So here we go. What I found in the shower. It all started on a very mundane day in our quaint Maine home. Yes, I know that's how every other scary sounding story starts, but it's usually because it's true. It was rather late, and as I did every night before bed, I hopped into the shower. I was enjoying the hot water as it relaxed my muscles, when I noticed something out of place being toyed around by the flowing water. Now, for the past 20 or so years, I've lived with only my father. I never knew my mother, as she passed when I was only 2 years old. Ever since the tragic incident, my father has always been a neat freak, never missing a day of cleaning, vacuuming, and dusting every conceivable surface in the house. Not a speck of grime, dust, or dirt could ever be seen without him taking care of it immediately after. On top of this, I knew for a fact that he had absolutely no interest in women anymore. It was likely a combination of his previous loss and his rather unattractive bald head. I had seen enough to know he had barely any hair on his body, in fact. So why is all of this even important? Well, on the floor of the shower, tempting to be sucked down the drain, was a single long black hair. I stared at it for a second, watching it be slowly dragged along, until I stopped it with my foot. How in the world had this managed to find its way in our house? Now, to anyone, this occurrence seems insignificant and rather foolish to make a big deal out of. But I knew my father, knew myself, knew our routines and our social ineptness, and knew that we barely ever left the house, and knew that no one other than ourselves had stepped through that front door in 20 years. I bent down to pick up the baffling strand of hair, the water quickly rushing down my back and into my face. And as I stood up, I turned the knob to stop its flow. I set it down on the sink as I stepped out, dried and dressed myself, then picked up the long, impossible thing. Call me paranoid if you will, but something about it just didn't feel right. It wasn't just its sudden and unexplainable appearance in my shower. It was the way it felt in my hand. It was heavier than it looked, far too heavy to be from any normal person's head. It was slightly thicker than your average strand of hair, and as I looked closer, I noticed that it looked more like fur. Deciding not to make a fuss of it, I tossed it in the trash and laid down on my bed. Thoughts of who or what could have placed this hair in our house danced in my mind as I drifted off to sleep, and those thoughts played further into my dreams. Images of great beasts in the yard, large rats in the walls, or a ring-inspired demon woman crawling out of my shower drain filled my head as I awoke with a start. I had heard a noise. Was it a shuffle? A knock? No, it sounded more like a click. With sleepy still heavy on my eyes and senses, I checked my room, the hall, and the front door. Nothing was out of place. I chalked it up to my dreams, as any normal person would. but the nagging feeling of doubt hung in the back of my mind, refusing to dissipate. After that, things around the house got weird. We noticed various small objects moving at first, not disappearing, just randomly seeming out of place. A pencil would be on the desk instead of in the drawer. A towel would be off its rack and on the floor nearby. A bar of soap would be on the other side of the sink. My dad simply said he was getting older and was probably just forgetting his actions, but brushed off my concerns of things in my room and bathroom moving, places he never went. Around that same time, we noticed the dust bunnies. No, that's not quite the right name. They were fluffy and blew around like dust bunnies, but they were much darker and made entirely of the same heavy hair I'd found in the shower. They certainly weren't alive or anything, as we both regularly plucked them off the ground unceremoniously and crushed them down into the trash. I noticed my dad became increasingly annoyed at their constant appearance, swearing it wasn't there just an hour ago before taking out the vacuum. Whatever was leaving these hairballs around was clearly getting to him, but still, he disregarded any of my concerns. One day, something happened to him that, at the time, we could not explain. Our basement is small, tiny even. The way down is a small set of stairs off the dining room that leads to a turn, then to two doors at a 90-degree angle from one another. One leads straight out from the turn to the dark laundry room, with naught but a dull bulb in a slit of a window, maybe less than a foot tall and 3 wide, illuminating the unfinished walls. The other, on the right, leads to the boiler room, even less finished and even darker. No windows were in that room, but it did feature another door on the same wall as the way that looped around to the laundry room. My dad stepped down the stairs as I sat eating a sandwich at the dining room table, carrying his load of laundry down to the dark room. As I munched on the lackluster meal, I suddenly heard a bump and a small crash. Standing up and staring down the dark stairs, I called out my father's name. No response. Assuming he had simply dropped the basket or something, I slowly crept down toward the door. It was closed, despite my dad being nowhere in sight. As I opened it and flipped on the switch, I noticed the lack of the basket or my father. Becoming increasingly worried, I called out his name again, louder and more urgent this time. I heard a stirring coming from behind and to the right, from the boiler room. It sounded like someone moving along the floor, with clicking. I slowly turned and opened the adjacent door to see my father's feet sticking out from behind the boiler. He was attempting to hoist himself up, having trouble at his older age. As I walked to the side to get a view past the boiler, I saw he was now sitting up, rubbing his head. The basket of laundry was on its side nearby, its contents strewn about the room. What made me question this event as far more than a simple fall were the dark strands and balls of hair surrounding and laying across my father. I helped him stand up and gather the laundry, and he explained that he had heard a sound from the boiler room, but couldn't remember what had happened after. As we searched the basement, the only things we found were the door from the boiler room to the laundry room was open, as was the slit of the window leading outside. Matted hair clung to the corners of the frame and on top of the dryer, likely what the intruder used to reach the window. We called the police, who showed up and did a thorough search of the house and surrounding area. All that was found were large footprints leading from the tiny window to the forest beyond, where they quickly became untraceable. After explaining his encounter, the police explained it was likely someone who broke in wearing some sort of poorly made Halloween costume, leaving behind the hair and the large footprints. They didn't have an explanation for all the hair around the house, likely thinking we were simply paranoid and connecting unrelated events. I even heard them joking about a Bigfoot break-in. What stood out to me, however, that no one else seems to take a notice of, was how in the world someone with shoes or feet that large could fit through such a small window. There was something more to all of this, I was sure of it. As I pondered the events the next day, we noticed the fur balls stopped appearing, at least at first. After about a week of their absence, they returned in full force, and now larger things began to move around the house, ranging from entire plates being on the wrong floor to couches being turned slightly. One night, the strangeness of it all began to become clear to me. This all wasn't possible. We were always home and would hear anyone else in the house. We especially would hear something like a couch being moved around, but somehow these things continued to happen without us as much as hearing a creak. The only explanation was that of the paranormal or supernatural. Click, click, click. It had to come from downstairs. Sitting up in my bed, I listened closely for the sound again. It did not come. I crept out of my room toward the dining room, noticing the clock read just after midnight. The usual sounds of bugs and owls from the forest outside were absent. Click, click, click. They were louder and spaced further apart now. They sounded like someone with long nails poking the walls or floor. The light at the bottom of the stairs flickered on as I flipped the switch. Click. The noises ceased. I was frozen with fear and panic at the top of the stairs, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The pumping of my heart and blood rushing through my head filled the silence of the night. I willed myself to take a step down onto the first stair, then another, then another. I was soon at the bottom and turned to face the laundry room door. It was ajar, with the light of the moon barely illuminating the darkness beyond. As I opened it, logic began to take hold of my actions, and I closed and locked it behind me. There was clearly something down here with me, most likely in the boiler room. Like that day my father was attacked, and I had to make sure it wouldn't loop around behind me to attack or escape. I noticed that the window and the other door to the boiler room were also ajar. As I snapped the window shut, I winced at the loud sound. Normally it would be nothing more than a click, but in the stillness and darkness of the basement it felt like thunder. I turned to face the unlocked ajar door to the boiler, noting with a twinge of fear the darkness beyond. The switch was located by the other door, at least a solid 3 steps from this one. I would have to enter in the darkness. As the door creaked open, I saw the dark form of the boiler ahead of me, but it seemed off. It was larger than I recalled. The light from the laundry room stopped short at its base, failing to illuminate who or what lay behind it. As I thought this, I realized with a shock that a new sound was now audible from the dark shape. Breathing. Locking the door behind me, I slowly sidestepped toward the other door, noting that it was also locked. There was no way out of the room now. Carefully, I reached toward the switch, never taking my gaze from the blotch of darkness ahead. I flipped it, and I wished that every fiber of my being that I had not seen what I beheld in front of me. What I saw fell short of the well-known cryptid, fell short of a reason, fell short of nature. It was tall, taller than 7 feet. It stooped down to keep its form within the room, the back of its neck touching the ceiling. The slender, fur-covered appendage of a neck above its shoulders curved down to its head, which was covered in thick, almost black strands of hair, just as the rest of its body was. It had long, drooping arms that reached to the ground. Where it should have had fingers were instead long, sharp, pointed claws, blacker than the night itself. But its head was what drew my gaze immediately. It lacked any features on its face, if you can call it that, save for its 2 awful eyes. They were large, at least 6 inches across, and were completely yellow. They had no pupils, no whites, not even any veins, just a sickening, unhealthy-looking yellow. They seemed to stare into me, into my soul, and in them I could see my life stretch beyond and before me. I saw death, I saw life, I saw beauty, hatred, disease, destruction. I saw evil itself. This was no ordinary cryptid or beast of the forest. This was a being as old as knowledge, as old as life, as old as death. The fear and awe that filled my head were too powerful. I fell to the ground, weeping and screaming, as I saw it step. No, it just appeared in front of me. Its claws clicked against the stone floor rhythmically, as if in some musical, horrible language. As it turned its head sideways, it never took its sickening eyes from me. My dad says he found me in a fetal position in the doorway, in a pool of tears, spit, vomit, and dark hair. When I saw him, I couldn't stop screaming. The next thing I remember after gazing upon that horrid creature was waking up in a hospital. The doctors explained in a confused manner that my body appeared to have gone 2 days without food or water. I tried to tell them of what I saw, of what they needed to know, but they all looked at me sadly, as if to say I was long gone. They thought I was insane. Everyone except my dad. Sometime later, he told me that he had come down those stairs when he heard my screams. He picked me up and began to rush me upstairs, but as he had passed by the small window, he saw 2 large yellow discs in the woods. He recalled that as he gazed toward them, he felt a fear unlike anything he had felt before, and knew that whatever had happened to me happened because of those horrid, evil eyes in the woods. After some rest and nourishment, I had physically recovered from the incident, but I knew I would never fully recover, not mentally at least. After realizing no one else would believe the ramblings of an insane man who had fallen to the ground and began screaming, I tried my best to act as if nothing was wrong. I got discharged with only some medications. After about a year, a long, agonizing year of only shreds of sleep, staring out into the forest, I moved out. I had enough money to do so, but it took a year for me to realize I could escape. I don't know why it took so long. Perhaps I was blinded by fear, but I was finally free. I wish I could say that's where it ended, that we never saw that thing again. But mere weeks after I left, I received a call. It was the police from the town my father lived in, the same officer that had investigated the initial assault. He informed me with solemn tones that my father was found on the floor of the basement, shriveled and seemingly drained of life, covered and surrounded by dark, long hair. I write this in the bathroom of my new small house in the hopes that everyone who reads it will heed my warning. If you see this horrible creature, or find bits of unexplainable dark hair in your house, you can try to run, you can try to escape. But the 2 yellow discs I just saw out my window confirm that this creature will always follow you. Okay, moving right along, let's get into our 4th story of the night, The Well of Wants. I have been to the well 3 times. On the first time I was 6. I went with my dad. My father had been reared on the outdoors. He lived for it. Every chance he got, he was out backpacking, fishing, hunting, anything. It was an addiction for him, one that would eventually kill him. 20 years after this story, he was climbing up a waterfall when he slipped and fell to his death. But he died doing what he loved, and he aimed to instill that love onto me. As a result, from the moment I could walk, I had spent more time in the woods than indoors. On this occasion, we were camping, and as we had done many times before, though never in this area of the woods. Though my father sought to teach me as much as he could about the outdoors, he realized a 6-year-old wouldn't be much help setting up a tent. He told me not to wander too far and set to work grappling with the tent, promising me we would have some cookies once he had finished. That naturally excited my young self, and I was practically giddy as I bounced around waiting for him to finish. After several repeats of, "Are you done yet?" and my dad's grunts becoming increasingly frustrated as the tent fought with him, he told me to go take a walk and come back in a few minutes. I headed off into the woods, listening to bird calls and trying to spot where they were coming from. After several minutes, I walked into a darker section of the woods. It was at that time where I noticed a peculiar smell emanating from somewhere nearby. It was the smell of baking cookies. Thinking my dad had finished, I excitedly ran off towards the smell, my young mind not comprehending my dad couldn't bake cookies in the woods or that the smell was coming from the opposite direction of my camp. I ran for 2 or 3 minutes before coming to a stop in a small clearing. The first thing I noticed was how much darker the woods were. This despite the fact that all the trees in the area were leafless, dead, and wilted. The ground was spongy. Water or some other liquid flowed up with every step I took, squashing the already wilted grass. Then I saw the well. It was sitting in the middle of clearing, a small circle of stones rising up 2 or 3 feet. Various tree roots had dug themselves into the stones, as if trying to get at the water contained inside, though the trees themselves had long since wilted and died. There was no roof or bucket attached. I realized that's where the smell of cookies were emanating from. I approached and peered over the edge of the stones. There was no water in the well, just a seemingly endless pit of blackness. I had picked up a stone and dropped it in, I never heard it hit the bottom. Then as I watched the liquid silently bubble up from the depths and came to a stop mere inches from my face. It had the consistency of water, with a slightly cloudier appearance. I realized the liquid was the source of the smell of cookies. I stuck my face into the liquid and began to gulp it. The taste was almost indescribable. It tasted like cookies, along with candy and every other delicious item a 6-year-old could ever imagine. I knew at that moment I would never taste anything better than that liquid. I began gulping faster and faster, not even stopping to breathe. I couldn't imagine ever stopping. I wouldn't ever stop. I would stand here forever, gulping down the delicious, heavenly, indescribable liquid from this well. My vision began to blur. My head became light. I kept on gulping the liquid. I felt something touch my shoulder. I ignored it, continued to aggressively gulp down the liquid. The touch turned to shaking. Something began pulling me away from the well. I kicked and screamed in protest, desperate not to be taken away from the liquid. I had to get more. I wanted more. I needed more. My eyes opened. I was sitting in the camp next to my dad, the tent finally up in one piece. My dad was holding a cookie out to me. "Here," he said. I took it and began nibbling it. It tasted nowhere as good as the liquid from the well. I looked out into the woods but realized the smell from the well was gone. On the second time I was 18, I went with my best friend. We had just recently graduated high school, and to celebrate we had gone for a week-long camping trip in the woods. Naturally, being the age where we brought along a fair amount of illicit substances and spent more time that week high than sober. I mostly stuck to weed and some mushrooms. My friend was into stronger substances. While I had been high most of the week, I'm fairly confident I was sober during this event. It was our last night before heading home, and I hadn't taken anything in the past few days, since it was my job to drive us home in the morning. My friend was tripping on who knows what and was lost in some cocktail of drugs, just staring at the sky and giggling intermittently. Eventually I got sick of listening to him and decided to take a walk. The last rays of sunshine dipping low below the horizon gave the woods an eerie, unnatural appearance. Shadows seemed to stretch and bend in every direction, giving the woods a wild and untamed appearance. It looked far different than the first time I'd ever been there. Not that I would have remembered anyway. I had long since repressed my memories of the well, and it was only this encounter with it that would bring my memories back to my mind. At some point I began to smell something indescribable. I truly have no words for it. It wasn't like the baking of cookies from last time, something much more ethereal, but just as unimaginably attractive. I followed the smell into the same clearing as before, and there the well was, sitting just as it had been. The smell continued to draw me closer. At that point I noticed something strange. There was the skeleton of a deer laying next to the well. It had its head down into the well as if it had died while drinking from it. I suspect it did. Littered around it were several rotting carcasses of wolves, having been drawn to the well by the deer. Somewhere in the corners of my mind alarm bells went off, and I was overcome with the most overpowering sense of déjà vu. But the smell was too overwhelming. I looked down into the well. The water or some liquid silently rose towards me. It had the same milky quality it had before, but the smell had changed. Without a moment of hesitation, I dunked my head in and began to inhale as much liquid as I could. It was just as amazing as I remembered, maybe even better. I began scooping water into my hands so I wouldn't have to stop, even if I lifted my head to breathe. I drank and drank, desperate to get more of this indescribable heavenly substance into my mouth. I began to clamber into the well, desperate to bathe in the liquid, to absorb it through every pore in my body. My head became light, my vision blurred. The slurred speech of my roommate stirred me as he shook my shoulder. Through his daze of semi-conscious words, he told me it was time to get to bed. I found myself back at the tent, and we headed into our sleeping bags. I didn't sleep at all that night. I was too focused on the well. My memories of the encounter when I was 6 came back. I was filled with desperate sense to go back and drink it once more. But something told me it was a bad idea, and I managed to resist the temptation. We packed up and left in the morning. After that summer, I moved away for college. My best friend stayed in town for his school. Over the years, his drug problem became worse, and when we were both juniors, he died of an overdose. I went back home for the funeral, then left again. I stayed away for many years until finally love and circumstance brought me back home, back to the well. On the third time, I was 40. I went with my wife. The well was calling out to me. I sensed it from the moment I entered those woods. My wife had never heard my encounter with the well and seemed unaffected by the smell. The smell was different again, but still indescribable, absolutely irresistible. It seemed to pour from every orifice and tree within the forest. As soon as we finished setting up our tent, I told my wife I was going on a walk. She plopped herself into a lawn chair, lit up a cigarette, and told me to have fun. I walked with purpose. I didn't know where I was going, but I did know the well would lead me to itself. The contagion from the well seemed to have spread, a much larger area of sodden ground and dead trees. The influence of the well was growing. I rounded a corner, and there it was. The extraordinary liquid was just waiting for me to take a taste. The deer skeleton was gone. There was a man there, and he was alive. His back was towards me, and he didn't seem to notice me as I approached. He was on his knees, head inside the well. I heard him lapping from the liquid like a dog. I walked up to him and tried to get his attention. He ignored me. I shook his shoulder. He shook me off and continued drinking. Finally, I wrenched him from the well and made him face me. His pupils were gone. In their place were just pure white orbs that seemed to function as eyes. He was emaciated. His skin was pulled tight over his thin body. His stomach was bloated, though it only contained liquid, no food whatsoever. He seemed to be only days away from starvation. His legs appeared to just be useless appendages. He had been kneeling for so long. His jaw hung open. He seemed to be unable to close it. I let out a yelp and jumped back. The man regarded me for a moment with his white, orb-like eyes. Then he turned and resumed his lapping from the well. I turned and ran until I collapsed at the feet of my wife. She asked me what was wrong. I told her I just saw a bear. We packed up the tent and moved to a different spot in the woods. I swore then I would never return to that well. For 20 years I was able to keep that promise. But then my wife died of lung cancer. I felt the well calling to me once again, and I was too overwhelmed with grief to resist. On the fourth time, I am 60. I go alone. The forest is dying. The well's infection is only spreading faster as it goes on. Every dead tree, every animal carcass, from everything in those woods pours the smell of the well. The smell is indescribable, but it seems to smell like peace. I want peace, at least the illusion of peace. I need to move on, but I know the well does not help with that. It is the well of wants. It gives you what you want, not what you need. And now all I want is to dunk my head into that heavenly well and never ever lift it again. That is exactly what I plan to do. Okay, now we're going to move on to our fifth and final story of the night. I hope everyone's been having an awesome time. I've been having a good time reading all of this. This one is titled The Closet at Grandma's. So here we go. Some of my favorite childhood memories took place in my grandparents' cabin. My older brother, Louis, and I would come every spring break and stay for the week. Our cousins came as well. We would spend the days swimming at the lake and driving around the neighborhood in the golf cart, affectionately named Alfie, and playing with the neighborhood dogs. The days were a blast. The nights, however, weren't my favorite times. My older cousin, Justin, invented a little game. It was excruciatingly simple. Basically, we took turns spending 15 minutes in the dark, cramped guest bedroom closet by ourselves. There was nothing special about this closet. The only scary thing about it was that it was a dark room in the bedroom at the back of the house, far away from the safety of the living room where our beloved grandmother sat in her chair watching Cheers and Frasier every evening. To my 6-year-old self, it may as well have been hell itself to be in the dark by myself. I never did make it for the whole 15 minutes. None of the younger cousins did, a fact which our older cousins used relentlessly to tease us. The 3 older kids, Louis, Justin, and Amaya, all managed to spend the full 15 minutes in the closet. and they all had different stories for what they experienced. Lewis claims a ghostly white woman grabbed at his throat. Amaya said a little boy with no eyes appeared beside her, laughing maniacally. But the story that scared me the most was Justin's. He claimed a man with glowing red eyes sat across from him in the closet. And do you know what he told me, Austin? He asked me in his dramatically low voice. For a kid of only 10, he sure was a good storyteller. What? I asked, peeking out from my blanket, trying and failing to hide my fear. He told me how I would die, how and when, every detail. His eyes gleamed as he spoke, boring into mine. And, well, how does it happen? I challenged, secretly hoping he'd end the story already. I don't think you'd want me to tell you that. See, it's a very gruesome death, very violent, but I can stop it from happening. All I have to do is tell someone else about. Then it will happen to them, not me. I haven't decided who I'm going to tell. Yet. He winked. So maybe you should keep that in mind next time you don't want to give up your turn driving, Alfie. Looking back now is pretty lame, and part of me knew that no kid would be nonchalant about his upcoming demise, especially one he deemed the worst possible way to go. But any time we would both reach for the last cookie or fight over whose turn it was to play a game, he would grin and say, "Are you sure you want to make me mad, Austin? You wouldn't want me to tell you a little story now, would you?" And I would always give in. It just didn't seem worth the risk. So that was the closet game. Justin, Lewis, and Amaya all loved it. The younger cousins, however, dreaded those nights when one of the older kids would grin and say, "Let's see if any of you can last in the closet tonight." My younger cousins were Amaya's younger sisters, 7-year-old Lena and 6-year-old Macy. Because they were both girls, the older kids, specifically Justin, didn't hound them nearly as much about being too chicken to last as he did me. "Don't worry about it, man," Lewis told me in private one night as we lay down in the guest bedroom for bed after playing the game. "He only gives you a hard time because you react. It's not a big deal if you can't stay in a stupid closet for 15 minutes. Lewis was always much nicer to me when other kids weren't around. "Well, I'm going to do it one day. I know I will," I declared. I was embarrassed that I'd once again ran out screaming after only a minute or two of sitting alone in the dark. "Sure you will, dude," Lewis yawned, and after a few minutes his light snores filled the room as I stared at the watermark ceiling, wide awake and reeling at how patronizing his tones sounded to my ears. "He's not the best brother, is he?" a voice hissed, jolting me out of my thoughts. I sat up straight in bed and glared at where I thought the voice had come from. The closet. The door was still open a crack. I stared at the sliver of darkness within. I started to think the voice must have been my imagination when a pale, white hand extended out of the black and beckoned me close. "Don't be afraid, Austin. I just want to talk." That's when I realized I recognized the voice. "Grandma?" I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "Come here, Cricket." The voice was definitely hers. Although there was something off about it, it wasn't her usual cheery voice. It was lower, more gravelly, sinister somehow. But the use of my grandma's special nickname for me lowered my guard a bit. I slowly lowered my feet to the floor and cautiously crept toward the closet. "Grandma?" I repeated. "What are you doing in there?" I could barely make out her frail shape within the small space. She looked to be crouched on all fours, peering through the opening towards me. As my eyes adjusted, I could see that she was smiling. "You sure have been letting the bigger kids get away with a lot lately, haven't you, Cricket?" "What do you mean? Why are you in the closet? I thought you went to bed." I looked over my shoulder at the door, thinking of going to Grandma's room. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, young man." I snapped back to attention. It was so rare for Grandma to snap at any of us kids. I wasn't used to the bite that was suddenly in her tone. Her face was right against the crack of the closet now. It was my grandma, but not. This woman was grimy. Dirt in the lines of her face. Her teeth were cracked and stained yellow, and her eyes were pure black. Darker than the room around her. They seemed to suck me in, like they were absorbing me somehow. I couldn't look away if I wanted to. "Nobody but wimps allows treatment like that," she whispered, those black eyes holding mine. "Brothers are supposed to look out for you, stand up for you, believe in you. When is the last time your brother told Justin to leave you alone?" Never. Lewis never defended me to Justin. He was too much of a coward to stand up to the cool older cousin. My grandma grinned at me. "You know what you should do, Cricket?" "Austin? Austin! Get off of him! What are you doing?" I suddenly felt several pairs of hands grabbing me and yanking me away. I fell hard to the floor as excited voices yelled all around me. "Lewis, are you okay? Is he breathing? Oh God, he's okay. Oh, thank you, God. Thank you." "Lewis, what happened?" "I don't know. He just went nuts. I don't know." I sat on the floor, trying to process the scene around me. Grandma and all my cousins were huddled around Lewis, who was sitting up in bed looking as dazed as I felt. I suddenly realized I was holding a pillow, and the lamp next to the bed had been smashed. The pieces slowly came together over the next hour. Lewis had awoken very suddenly when a pillow was slammed over his face. He fought against it but was surprised at how strong the force was. Luckily, his thrashing had knocked over the lamp, which had awoken my cousin sleeping next door, and they had roused my grandma. They ran into the room to find me leaning on the pillow over my brother, an enraged look on my face. It was so out of character for me. I had always been a very timid and easygoing child. Nobody expected such an act of violence out of me. My parents took me to therapy, of course. I told them what I could remember, that my grandmother had come into the room and told me to do it. That was, of course, ridiculous. My grandmother had been sound asleep in her room. There was no question about this, considering all of my cousins had to wake her up to get her to come to save my brother. The therapist never could give my parents any satisfactory answers on why I snapped. The relationship between my brother and me obviously took a huge hit after that night. It took a long time for him to hang out with me again, even longer to stop sleeping with his bedroom door locked. But eventually, as the months went on without me taking another attempt at his life, he started to relax. My family stopped watching me from the corners of their eyes like I was a bomb about to go off. The event was chalked up to me being a little boy who was angry at being picked on and didn't know how to express my anger. They kept me in therapy for a while longer, but I had quickly learned not to mention the woman who whispered to me from the closet. I was smart enough to just go along with what the therapist instructed me to do. Breathing exercises when I get angry, talking about my feelings instead of burying them, etc. And those visits eventually ended as well. That was over 20 years ago. It was a little more than an unpleasant memory until last week when my wife, my 5-year-old son, and I traveled back to my hometown to help my parents arrange my grandmother's funeral. She had passed peacefully in her sleep, and we all knew it had been a long time coming, considering the woman was in her late 90s. I had agreed to go through Grandma's belongings to save my mother the heartache. I was even looking forward to spending time with my son, Rowan, in the same house. I had so many happy memories from his age. However, this process was not the fun, sentimental trip down memory lane I had envisioned. Grandma had taken to hoarding in her final years, and trying to separate the trash from the valuables was a time-consuming feat. Plus, my son's constant energy and demand for attention from his mom and me led to me snapping and yelling at him much more than I'm proud to admit. After I'd almost lost my mind over him accidentally shattering a glass snow globe that I knew Grandma had really loved, my wife decided it was time to call it a night and get some rest. We had planned to get a hotel, but due to our exhaustion, we decided to just crash in the guest bedroom, all 3 of us falling onto the bed. This room was surprisingly untouched by Grandma's hoard. I passed out almost immediately. I awoke later to the sound of my wife's voice floating from across the room. I could barely hear her and was sure she was trying not to wake me, but I've always been an incredibly light sleeper. When I heard Rowan's voice whisper back, I assumed she was just up to help him find his way to the bathroom in the hoard and rolled over to go back to sleep. Instead, I snapped wide awake when I saw my wife sleeping peacefully beside me and no Rowan between us. I sat up in bed and turned toward the closet where the voices were coming from. Dreadful memories rushed back to me as I saw my son crouched in front of the closet door, and made out the words that were being said. "Daddies should never yell the way yours does, Rowan. Why aren't you stopping him?" A distorted version of my wife's voice was whispering. I don't know," Rowan answered. "You know what you need to do, Peanut," the thing cooed. I'd heard enough. I jumped out of bed and barreled across the room, throwing the door open. Nothing was there. I searched through the hanging clothes and the boxes of junk to no avail. Whatever had been talking to my son was gone. We left that night and never returned. I let my brother finish up the rest of the packing. I never went to see that room, and especially that closet, ever again. And that was our final story of tonight, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening. I'll be back soon with a group of new scary stories. But in the meantime, if you'd like this video and subscribe, it would mean a lot as I'm trying to grow this channel. Once again, I am Mr. Dead Sleep, and good night.